delighted that you've chosen to be here on this special and important occasion. Just one housekeeping rule for our in-person audience, a reminder to please turn off your mobile devices. Thank you. We're joined tonight by esteemed members of the judiciary, justices of the Constitutional Court, judges from across the bench, as well as board members of the Legal Resources Center. A warm welcome also to our staff, of course, our colleagues, our partners, friends, longtime supporters of the center, and to all those streaming from across the country and beyond. Your presence is what affirms the enduring importance of this lecture and the work that we all carry forward together. This evening, we're especially privileged to be joined by members of Bram Fischer's family. We welcome his daughter, Ilza Fischer-Wilson, as well as her husband, Tim. Thank you both for being here in person with us tonight. We also wish to acknowledge his other daughter, Ruth Rice, who unfortunately couldn't make it in person, but whose presence is definitely felt with us in spirit. As his family, your presence is perhaps the most powerful reminder that the legacy we celebrate tonight is not just a part of this country's history, but is a living, breathing inheritance. We also extend a heartfelt thank you to our partners here at Bowman's, whose continued generosity in hosting this lecture year after year enables us to come here and gather as we have tonight to reflect, learn, and be inspired. A special word of appreciation goes to Fatima Lahe, who's the director of the Pro Bono department here at Bowman's, and a woman whose commitment and leadership are simply invaluable. Fatima will be speaking immediately after me, and I look forward to handing over to her in just a second. Now, of course, the highlight of tonight's program will be the lecture delivered this year by none other than Justice Steven Majiedt of the Constitutional Court. We're truly privileged to have the judge in our midst, and he will be introduced formally as well in just a second. The Bram Fischer Memorial Lecture is an opportunity to pause. It's an opportunity to reflect and to meditate on the values that have defined Bram Fischer's life. Values such as courage, integrity, and an unwavering support for justice. As we reflect tonight, let's also ask ourselves how we can embody those very same values today. Bram Fischer made immense sacrifices through his life, including his very freedom. He did all of this because he believed in a South Africa where equality and justice would prevail. His example is precisely what inspires and challenges us to carry forward the struggle for justice in our own generation. As we begin tonight's program, let's do so with gratitude. A genuine gratitude for the life and for the legacy of Bram Fischer. Let's also do so with a renewed determination to advance the values that he stood for so relentlessly. Thank you all once more for being here with us tonight. It's now my pleasure to hand over to Fatima. Let's give her a round of applause as she takes the podium.
Good evening, everybody. It's really awesome to see that the auditorium is so full. So it's wonderful that everybody has made the time to come out this evening. For those of you that may not know me, I am Fatima Lahe, and I head up the Pro Bono at Bowman's. This evening, I'm actually standing in for our chairperson, Ezra Davids, who sends his apologies as he is traveling and he's out of the country. I would also like to begin by acknowledging Justice Majiedt. It is an honor to be with you this evening, Justice Majiedt, as well as Justice Cameron and Justice, one of the other constitutional Justices Yaqub, sorry. I know that we have a lot of members, senior counsel that's present with us This evening, I acknowledge Nelson Gamenda, from National Director of the LRC, and his staff, as well as a family of Bram Fischer, fellow colleagues, friends, and guests. My task this evening is a very simple but a beautiful one, to extend a warm welcome to all of you on behalf of Bowmans. We are delighted to host the LRC this evening for the 13th Bram Fischer Memorial Lecture. Of course, many of us stand on the shoulders of people like Bram Fischer, who came before us, and that is something we are and must be grateful for. Bowmans is an extensive pro bono program across all our offices on the continent. In addition, we make a conscious effort to also ensure that we make our resources available for worthy causes in the public interest. And it is for this reason that it is important for us to host this event this evening. We also try to support the work which the LRC does in any way we're able to, and our chairperson, Ezra, is on the board of the LRC. But then, for many of us, LRC is an organization after our own hearts. It is not really an organization, as my dear son would say, it is holy territory. It is an institution. On a personal note, this event is particularly special, as almost 35 years ago, I commenced my career with a fellowship at the LRC at a very different time in our country's history. And then, some 3 years ago, my dear son completed his articles at the LRC. So you can see that it is very much, for me, a family affair. Many of us thus have fond memories of our association with the LRC. Thank you, Nelson, and to your staff for giving us this opportunity to host you this evening. It is an absolute pleasure for us to do so. To our keynote speaker this evening, Justice Majiedt, we look forward to your address. To the entire LRC, to all of the guests this evening, once again, a very warm welcome on behalf of Bowmans. I hope that you have a comfortable, memorable, and insightful evening with us, and thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to be with us this evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fatima. Good evening, distinguished guests, colleagues, friends, and supporters of the Legal Resources Center. It's a privilege to welcome you to the 13th Bram Fischer Lecture. This biannual gathering honors Bram Fischer's courage and commitment to justice, values that continue to guide the LRC's work to this day. We are honored to have Justice Steven Majiedt as our speaker this evening, and grateful, as always, to our partners and supporters who make both this lecture and our ongoing work possible. This evening is part of a much larger journey, a journey of deepening democracy in our country and broadening access to justice in South Africa. It's a journey we cannot travel alone, and we are grateful to walk it with so many committed allies. I know some people don't like the word allies, but it's a nice one. To open tonight's proceedings formally, it's my absolute pleasure to invite the chairman of the LRC Board of Directors, Advocate Thandi Lane. Amongst her numerous roles in South Africa, her leadership continues to ensure that the LRC remains true to its mission while meeting the challenges of our time. Please join me in welcoming Advocate Thandi Lane.
Thank you, Nelson. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's really a pleasure and an honor to stand here before you and share some of the memories, some of what we are witnessing today, and dream for a better future. So when I think of Bram Fischer, firstly, I would like to acknowledge every one of you here. I would like to acknowledge everybody who's joined us virtually. It's a heartwarming feeling to see the number of people in person and online, and to realize how many people are very conscious of human rights, democracy, and constitutionalism in this country. When I reflect on Bram Fischer, I reflect on choices that we make throughout our lives as people, as societies, as countries, and as the world. Bram Fischer's life highlights the extraordinary decision that he made to reject the privilege and power of his upbringing to fight for justice, equality, and freedom, standing firmly against apartheid despite the personal risks. On that note, I would like to acknowledge his family. And again, I feel privileged that I spent years across the desk from Ilsa Wilson, who was also working at the LRC at the same time as I was. I also would like to thank her sister, who in the background has supported us fully, and also her husband, Dr. Tim Wilson, who, despite his own contribution to the struggle, continued to support Ilsa, the Fischer family, as well as the LRC. I just want to note that the ties between Bram Fischer and the LRC go deep, and it's reflected on the people who form the LRC. Those who may be young and may not be lawyers and would not have read the cases is one that stands out, one of the Rivonia trials that he, together with people like Arthur Chaskerson and George Bezos, drove to make sure that we see democracy today. Having said that, it is not my night to be the guest speaker. I'm here to introduce our guest speaker. People have mentioned Justice Steven Majiedt, and it is my honor and pleasure to just say a few words. In a similar way, Justice Majiedt's personal history and values reflect the values that Bram Fischer held dearly. His life reflects his own experiences of racial discrimination, his perseverance to join the Cape Bar, and how these experiences shaped his deep empathy for the oppressed and his commitment to principled leadership. He said to me as we were walking in, "Please don't read my profile until I'm blushing." And I promise that I'm going to be very short. So this is not the tip of the iceberg of what I would like to share with you. When he joined the Constitutional Court in 2019, he had had a distinguished career in the Supreme Court of Appeal and the Northern Cape High Court. I have to go back a little bit. He was born in the small town of Kenhardt in the Northern Cape. A lot of us don't know where that is. He was born to a family of educators, raised on values of liberation and service. Like most of us at the time, after completing his BA Law and LLB at the University of the Western Cape, Justice Majiedt was blocked from joining an attorney's firm due to racial discrimination, and particularly the Group Areas Act. Undeterred, he joined the Cape Bar in 1984, practicing alongside anti-apartheid legal giants like Dalla Omar, who became his mentor, You will recall that he was the first Minister of Justice in the new democracy. He spent much of his early career defending political activists and working in the trenches, literally, of the liberation struggle. His contribution extended to assisting in South Africa's first democratic elections and helping establish governance in the Northern Cape. He is widely respected for his jurisprudence, which I always read with relish, including landmark rulings on international criminal law and statutory interpretation. Known for his humility and clarity, he believes judges must remain grounded, always remembering they serve the people. I can attest to this because he's my neighbor. He's a family man, a keen golfer, and proud South African with deep ancestral roots. Justice Majiedt carries with him a powerful legacy of resistance, intellect, and quiet strength. As he once said, I quote, "My inclination will always be for the downtrodden, the oppressed, for the little guy, because that's what shaped my whole philosophy as a young lawyer." I like that because he makes no apology. Ladies and gentlemen, let us welcome Judge Steven Majiedt.
Thank you, Sistandi. As she says, we are neighbors, and she was kind enough not to say keen but terrible golfer. It sounds like a hollow cliche to say it, but it's truly an honor and a privilege to be here this evening at this prestigious lecture. Now, I acknowledge the presence of colleagues here, particularly Justices Cameron and Yaqub, predecessors at the court, other justices here, eminent counsel, members of the legal profession from the bar and the sidebar, and also in particular the Fischer family. I don't know if Ilse is here, but I said to Nishan earlier, I'd really love to meet her because I feel like I know her having read the books. And also Ruth, who I understand is online. And I had a look. I also want to acknowledge all other guests who are here and thank in particular the LRC for affording me this opportunity. It's an organization that I have great admiration and respect for. And let me immediately also acknowledge the role that large corporate firms like Bowman's play in public interest law, and Fatima and others. And I know Mr. Michael Katz is also here. They run a large public interest component in their firm. But also other civil society organizations that are here. The law reports are replete of instances of organizations coming to court and changing not only the law, but most importantly, changing the lives of so many of our people. And for that, I am truly grateful. Now, I had a look at the list of the 12 previous speakers. And by a long country mile, I'm the least qualified and the least well-known of the speakers. But I can confidently say this: of the speakers that went before me, I'm the only one who share Afrikaans as a mother tongue language with Bram Fischer. That's the closest I will ever come to being compared to Bram Fischer. Now, I said to Nissan, this is going to be the topic of my presentation. And I quote, "Everything's going to be all right. You will see." Close quote. The resilience of Bram Fischer and the resilience required of constitutionalism and the rule of law. So you may have wondered where the title of the lecture comes from and how the title of Bob Marley and the Wailers classic found its way into such a prestigious lecture. I read in Stephen Klingman's wonderful biography of Bram this striking message, and I quote, "Alles sal regkom, jy sal sien," close quote. Loosely translated, that means, yeah, everything's going to be all right. You will see. It was a phrase which Bram's wife Molly wrote in a letter to Ilse just 2 days before the start of the Rivonia trial. And that phrase, strangely enough, is borrowed from, of all people, President Paul Kruger. Now, when I read that phrase, it reminded me that that too was Bram's outlook on life. Despite all the travails and challenges, he honestly believed that alles sal regkom, everything's going to be all right. His was a very complex personality. And for me, that Afrikaans saying vividly illustrates his resilience in the face of the most extraordinary adversity. And I will endeavor to show in this presentation that that resilience of a Bram Fischer is what we sorely need for our grand constitutional project at this time. It's a time of persistent, overt, and subliminal assaults against constitutionalism and the rule of law, an assault that also comes from within our motherland, from in South Africa. And that assault finds resonance all over the globe as we see pushback. The rise of populism, we see pushback against democracy in general and constitutionalism in particular. Now, as I've said, Bram was known as an unfailing optimist, even to his own detriment. When he was still in prison, he heard of the freedom that was attained by Zimbabwe, and he prophesied that the revolution in South Africa was just around the corner. And he had little idea of just how many years of hard, bitter struggle it would still take. But such was his unfailing faith and resilience in the nature of South Africans to overcome, that he never gave up hope. And although he was not there to see it, that hopes have been realized. In 1965, shortly before his second arrest and before the commencement of his own trial, he met with his counsel, George Bizos, and George asked him, after embracing him, asked Bram, had all of this been worth it? And Bram was quite upset because, you know, his response was simply clear-cut. He had spent 9.5 months underground, and before that, many, many years of selfless activism, sacrificing his family, his profession, his friends. So how could you ask him if everything had been worth it? And so Bram asked George, where he'd asked their friend Nelson, that's Nelson Mandela, the same question. We surely had sacrificed all of that and more. No, said George Bizos, he hadn't. So Bram said, well, then don't ask me. Because he said this because it was painful for Bram that the essential character of his action of protest required justification of over all these years. That to ask of him that it appeared to be unnatural for a white man to make these sacrifices for a new and free South Africa more than it was for a black man. So how could one make that such an inquiry? And that says a lot about Bram Fischer. It speaks of integrity and the rigorous standard of morality to which he held himself. And when one reads the biography and you learn about this remarkable patriot, you are left with the enduring impression that intrinsic to his nature as a person, but also to his understanding and application of the oppressive law of the time, the way he practiced it and the way he chose to obey and disobey it, that here was a giant of South Africa who held himself to a high, very high standard. Now in the book you will read about an interesting occurrence where Bram was part of the Joint Council of Europeans and Africans in Bloemfontein in the 1920s. This council brought together black and white men to discuss issues of mutual concern. And after that meeting, one meeting, Bram had for the first time in his life had to shake hands with a black man. He was still a young man at the time. And after years of indoctrination, Bram found himself overwrought by a feeling of revulsion, which he had to force himself to suppress. That had a lasting impact on him. He did serious introspection and asked of himself, but how can it be that shaking the hand of a man with a different pigmentation could stir me to such revulsion? It had a dramatic effect on his life because that was his own small Damascus experience. And at his trial, he talks about the strange revulsion that he had experienced. And he said he could find no rational basis for it, and he felt deeply ashamed. Before his first trial, that's the one in the middle of which he would disappear and go underground, leaving his counsel with a letter to read to the court, Bram had the opportunity easily and without risk to harm to those left behind to remain in England where he had fled and not to return, thus absconding and violating the conditions of his bail. So when he was granted bail after being arrested under the then Suppression of Communism Act, he had to appear as counsel in the Privy Council in London in the well-known Bayer copyright case, which he would go on to win. Whenever he applied to the court to grant him bail, he said, quote, I have no intention of avoiding a political prosecution. I am an Afrikaner. My home is South Africa. I will not leave my home because my political beliefs conflict with those of the government ruling the country. Close quote. So for him, the responsibility lay with his own self. Because while the government had done its utmost to corrupt the Afrikaner identity, he believed it was his responsibility to put forward a different alternative definition of what Afrikanerdom is all about. So when somebody asked him later, why did you go back from England after that trial to go and face trial? He simply said, because I said I would. He had made an undertaking in a court of law of which he was an officer. And Anthony Eastwood called it, quote, a quaint loyalty to the legal tradition from which he had come. It's an impression shared by Joe Slovo. This complex character of a committed revolutionary balanced with a personal honor to be true to a personal undertaking. But then, of course, later when the trial commenced, he skipped bail and elected to go underground, defied the law, and he said in the letter read out in court in his absence that he cannot be within this system and he can no longer serve justice in the way he had attempted to do during the previous 30 years. Now, it remains a sad fact that the Johannesburg Bar Council, with astonishing alacrity, resolved within a mere 2 days, I repeat 2 days of the estreatment of Bram's bail, to move an application for his striking off from the role of advocates. Equally amazing and inexplicable was that the decision was taken in Cape Town and that the Minister of Justice was confidentially informed of the decision. As Gilbert Marcus and Janet Kentridge rightly point out, it remains unclear why the Bar Council acted with such unseemly haste and why they deemed it necessary to inform the Minister of the striking off application. As they correctly conclude, that was an unjust application because it disregarded the moral and political considerations which had moved Bram to this conduct and which had removed him from the realm of a dishonorable and self-serving deception, making it instead a supreme moral sacrifice, as those two authors rightly call it. Of course, the application was successful and the court rejected the contentions that his conduct did not relate to his profession as an advocate and that it cannot be categorized as unworthy conduct. That, dear friends, was just another ripple in a sea of injustice with the judiciary of that time, one of the leading sea men. And yes, they were all men at the time. Within the law and without, Bram's life was given to the cause of justice. When you look back at the sacrifices that he has made, and one of the earlier speakers referred to Bram's life as one of choice. If you look at the sacrifices and the choices that he has made, One is struck by how he could so easily have slid into a comfortable life of prestige, wealth, and comfort. He came from what is closest to Afrikaner royalty as one could have at the time, and the Orange Free State. We know that his grandfather, Bram Fischer, whose name he bore, was the prime minister of the colony and a lawyer. And his father, Percy Fischer, later became the judge president of the Orange Free State. And of course, by marriage to his beloved Molly, both of them were throughout committed to the transformation and liberation of South Africa. Molly was related to both Jan Smuts and President Steyn. And ironically, it was Granny Steyn who remarked on Bram's 21st birthday, which then was, of course, the coming of age, that, quote, "I know that Bram Fischer is going to play an honorable role in the history of South Africa," close quote. She would be right, but not for the reasons that anyone in that particular circle could have foreseen. Bram's early life mirrored that of the family he came from, and that's understandable. Like his father and his grandfather before him, he was a nationalist and an anti-imperialist. Those two concepts in the early 20th century were indistinguishable for Afrikaner South Africans, nationalism and anti-imperialism. But the Fischers were critical thinkers, and they were committed to dissent. In Bloemfontein, they held lectures from visiting intellectuals and with other outlook and other ideas. We know that his father Percy attended Cambridge, and Bram would go to Oxford on a Rhodes Scholarship. There, Bram was not only exposed to communism, but also physically visited the then USSR. And then he saw the other side of things, the rise of fascism in Europe. And so this had a lasting effect on him when he came back to South Africa. Now, these days, we often hear the phrase lawless when we discuss the state of our imperfect but persevering South African society. I think many of us who use that phrase forget the events of not too far away past, where law became a tool in the hands of a cruel and inhumane government, which it changed and rechanged and retrofitted to meet its ends. Nonetheless, the fascinating aspect of our history, my friends, and the resilience of the rule of law in South Africa is that it became one of the primary tools used both to enforce the oppression of the apartheid regime and to fight it. And in all of that, Bram Fischer was a central figure. He was a mean silk. He was a man of great intellect. He was a lawyer held in great esteem. And as I said, he came to what is the closest to Afrikaner royalty that you could get in that trial. And of course, then he led in the treason trial. And it ran for 5 years. What a formidable team it was. Bram, Izzy Meisels, Sidney Kentridge, and others. And that legal forum became a political trial. Those who comment on that trial remark about how counsel had brilliantly pestered the defense, pestered the Crown on each and every legal point they could find. And later, all these charges were dismissed for baselessness and embarrassing lack of specificity. We still get badgered, we still get pestered, but not to the same level and standard of those eminent counsel. And so this trial was the forerunner of the Rivonia trial, which was marked by the subversion of the rule by B.J. Foster, who sat throughout that trial in attendance. It was like he had to see firsthand that if the enemies of the state could not be crippled by the law, then the law had to be changed, which is what happened. And so there they were, formidable team again, Fischer, Shaskelson, Bezos, Joffe. It had a lasting impression on the lives of not only those lawyers, but also those of us who came afterwards. But everybody knew after the Rivonia trial, it was only a matter of time before Bram himself was arrested, which of course he was, 3 times before his final prison sentence. I want to just briefly reference Bram's statement from the doc. I alluded earlier, you'll recall, about Molly using the words of President Paul Kruger when she said, "Alles sal regkom, jy sal sien." But in his statement from the doc, amongst others, Bram said the following, referencing the words of President Kruger, quote, "In prophetic words, in February 1881, one of the great Afrikaner leaders addressed the President and Volksraad of the Orange Free State. His words are inscribed on the base of the statue of President Kruger in the square in front of this court. After great agony and suffering after 2 wars, they were eventually fulfilled without force or violence for my people." And President Kruger was then quoted. He said this, I've translated it, "With confidence we lay our case before the whole world. Whether we conquer or whether we die, freedom shall rise in Africa like the sun from the morning clouds." That was the quote from President Kruger. And then Bram went on to say, after quoting this, "In the meaning which those words bear today, the day when he was in the dock, they are as truly prophetic as they were in 1881. My sole motive in all I have done has been to prevent a repetition of that unnecessary and futile anguish which has already been suffered in one struggle for freedom," close quote. And so, years later, when he was sitting in a prison cell in Pretoria, in so much pain that he could not move, delirious and confused as to where he was because he was deliberately being denied medical care for the cancer which was eating away at him, Bram was tormented by the warden who, it was said, took particular pleasure in humiliating him as a result of his status as an Afrikaner who had betrayed the folk. Bram was not allowed to attend his own son's funeral while in prison, and ultimately his ashes after his death were lost forever in the prison system because the police refused to let his family have his body. And then we are asked, my dear friends, that we must stop harking back to apartheid and stop remembering the past. We must never do that. When I drove with our only child in Cape Town and showed her we couldn't swim on that beach and we couldn't ride on that bus, she asked, "Daddy, but why not?" And we must keep on reminding them about that, lest something similar happens. And don't say to me, well, it's unlikely that will ever happen again. If you look at what is happening in Gaza today, you wonder how a people who have gone through a Holocaust, that when you walk in that Holocaust museums at the Smithsonian or wherever, even in Poland itself, you are moved to tears, and then you wonder how people could affect what is happening in Gaza today. And so let us not stop reminding our children and our grandchildren about what has gone on in this country and about people like Bram Fischer. So after they refused to let his family have his body, Stephen Klingman movingly writes this, and it really moved me. He says, "So Bram's ashes returned to the prisons department, but he was light and had gone into air, and they couldn't touch him again." So as I conclude on his life, before I move to the second and last part of my presentation, this was a much revered giant of our liberation struggle. I can do no better than to repeat the words of former President Nelson Mandela, which Stephen Klingman quotes in that wonderful biography when asked by Klingman, what significance Bram's life has for us. Mr. Mandela said, and I quote, Bram has become immortal. His name has become immortal. Close quote. And here's another one from a completely different, unexpected quarter. When told by Izzy Meisels that Bram had passed away, Judge Rumpf, who had presided in the treason trial, said to Izzy, quote, "You know, he'll be remembered long after you and I are forgotten." Close quote. And may I just say, it's wonderful that the LRC and Bowmans host this lecture biennially. It's a wonderful tribute to a giant who has set all of us free. And so then, friends, as I turn to the second part, what are we to learn from this great South African? A man who swam upstream for most of his life, who defied social, race, and class conventions, and who used the detestable apartheid laws as best he could to fight that pernicious crime against humanity. Surely it would have meant the world to Bram Fischer to see his country released from the weight of oppression which apartheid had brought, including on those who imposed it. Here's the thing that is the most striking to me. This man never surrendered nor transcended his Afrikaner identity in taking up the struggle. Rather, he took up the struggle because of that identity and came to change its possibility. And so earlier when Sistandi introduced me, she spoke about my stint as one of the co-conveners or in charge of the elections in the Northern Cape in 1994. Now, you know, the Northern Cape is a harsh, vast landscape. 30% of the South African landmass, but only just over 1 million people live there, very sparsely populated. And so on the day of the elections, 27 April 1994, De Beers gave us one of their planes. It was a prop, so that you could land you couldn't land with a jet on some of those airfields. It was a prop. And so my colleague and I got into this little plane. It's so small that the pilot would pass you a cold drink back and ask, "Are you guys okay?" And sitting right behind him. But when we flew in the Northern Cape over small towns, we landed at some. It really brought tears to my eyes to see this queues snaking, or people just wanting to make that cross. And when I think back to those days, it makes me realize that Bram Fischer's sacrifice was not in vain. Sometimes it may seem so as we look around the world as, today, but that sacrifice was not in vain. And so, friends, at a time when our country appears to have made powerful enemies, essentially as a result of our brave stance in the ICJ and our unwavering commitment to universal principles of human rights and freedom for all, and at a time when we see dangerously rising populism, nationalism, and self-absorption, there is a growing severe pushback against constitutionalism. Even within our own borders, we see mushrooming constitutional skepticism, disillusionment, and at the extreme, a call for the abolition of the Constitution. Our much admired Constitution is being decried at worst as a sellout document and at best as a failure to transform our seriously unequal society and to uplift the poor. Now, every system of governance inevitably faces criticism, and our system and Constitution are no exception. Some criticisms are, of course, more valid than others. A notable critic of our Constitution has argued that South Africa's culture of constitutionalism borders on fetishism and theology with excessive faith in the Constitution, which they argue is ultimately a modernist, Eurocentric doctrine conflating formal inclusion with liberation, ignoring structural oppression, and leaving economic and cultural powers undisturbed. Another broader criticism is that of constitutional fundamentalism, the idea that it is up to the courts alone to vindicate the rights of the Constitution. Now, much of this, of course, we know has emanated from the fact that, especially in recent years, courts have had to step in where political solutions fail. When this occurs, and may I just add and point out that ironically, these applications are often instigated by the very people most likely to criticize the courts for interfering, calling judges unelected persons who want to abrogate power, all power to themselves. When this happens, it puts our constitutional system itself in danger. Now, it is self-evident and axiomatic that judicial institutions have inherent limits. We are bounded by the principles of legality, by the rule of law, to exercise no more powers than that granted to us by the Constitution and the law. And so when we are asked to breach the separation of powers, as is increasingly happening, as you find that the executive is not delivering to people, as you find that Parliament is not legislating, and even where they get deadlines to legislate, they don't do so, we are being asked all the time to push the bounds of the separation of powers, especially in the apex court. And so now what must we do, ladies and gentlemen? We must step up. We must go into the dock like Bram Fischer. Those who accuse the Constitution of being an obstacle for transformation, the product of a fraud compromise, forget the role that active citizenship and participation of civil society has played. And Bram Fischer is the very embodiment of active citizenship. He used the law as a primary tool to fight apartheid, but he knew it was not enough, and that is why he had to join the struggle from underground. So this disillusionment and constitutional pessimism goes beyond our shores. Recently, in the front cover of the Guardian Weekly, the headline read, "Are we witnessing the death of international law?" And the article goes on to explain how a growing number of scholars and lawyers are losing faith in the current system. Some say the law is to blame, others the states that are supposed to uphold the law. And this article goes on to explain that over the past decade, key institutions upholding the international order have been diminished, crippled, and compromised. And they point to the US withdrawal from international organizations and agreements, including the UN Human Rights Council. They point to the lamentable US sanctions on ICC judges. Recently at the J20, the judicial equivalent of the G20, which we had not far away from here, the Chief Justice of Brazil, João Barroso, bemoaned the fact that they could not travel, he and his colleagues, as they do annually, to the international seminar at Yale University, because they've been denied visas. And we know that the judge who presided over the former President Bolsonaro's trial have now been sanctioned too. And so, in considering Bram Fischer's legacy, as I close, we must keep asking hard questions of ourselves as South Africans, and human rights advocates in particular. And those in the room, that's what we are. All those years ago, Bram had to fight not only against injustice, but also against his own people, against Afrikaners. And so, for him, it was exactly who his people were. For Bram Fischer, healing the division in South Africa was for him personal and political. Now, cognizant of the fact that we have this constitutional skepticism and disillusionment, I want to just close by relating this to you. During October last year, 24, my then current and past law clerks and I held something of a reunion dinner. At that dinner, we discussed at my prompting how we can get involved in a meaningful community outreach program. And then one of them suggested that we revive the wonderful initiative first started by my dear friend and retired colleague, Edwin Cameron, who's here, and in whose chambers I said he's got good karma, I can assure you. He had a program on constitutional literacy for underprivileged schools. Now, Edwin used to go out with his law clubs to township schools once a month to talk about constitutionalism and the Constitution. This proposal met with full and enthusiastic consensus by all present at that dinner. So now, ladies and gentlemen, in collaboration with the We the People South Africa Trust, formerly known as the Constitution Hill Trust, the Constitution Hill Development Company, and the Alt Advisory Foundation with my chambers, we select a few grades of underprivileged learners from schools around Gauteng, and we bring them to the Constitutional Hill precinct every second Saturday. We give them breakfast, and then they are taken on a short tour of the precinct and then the court. In the court, one of the judge who is present on duty that week present a short talk on constitutionalism, the Constitution, and also about the court and the judge, him or herself. Now, I must say, some of my colleagues, I'm glad to say, have joined this initiative so that we rotate, and I'm getting others on board too, those who are in Johannesburg. And then after my or the other judges talk in the court, they go to the court's auditorium, where the law clerks and other stakeholders discuss specific aspects of the Constitution with them. And about lunchtime, they leave with a packed lunch. Now, in this small but I think impactful way, we are trying to counter this growing skepticism and disillusionment. Because it's important that we do that. I mean, a constitution is an inanimate object. It can't implement itself. Those who must implement it are failing to do so. And then the constitution gets blamed. And this is what we're trying to explain to them in as simple a language as possible. What is this constitution? What is this supreme law? Why is it so important? And importantly, how did we get from this repressive, inequitable system to where we are today? Now we give them chance to ask questions, and the questions that they ask speak of unaccountability, violence, and anger. Some of the questions: why don't you bring back the death penalty? Why are prisons so nice to people if they are allowed to keep coming back and stealing and raping people? Why is it that illegal people are allowed to come here and are protected? Those are the questions they ask. And yes, they did once ask me, is it true that judges are corrupt? We'll wait and see what Mbuyiseli Madlanga finds after all of this. Now, ladies and gentlemen, these questions from these children are the questions of this country. And much like in Bram Fischer's day, it's not up to the law alone to answer them. And you know, when they go to the auditorium, we ask them questions, mostly the law clerks. Ask them, what do you think the law is? What is a right? Can you name rights that you have? And what does it mean to do the right things? And the answers are more revealing than one would expect. Once about a question about Operation Dudula, which you know is preventing foreigners from access medical facilities in South Africa. One student said, I suppose doing the right thing means that we should try our best to make sure that no one gets hurt, even when we think they are doing the wrong thing. And so these are the answers that we must face up to. These are the answers and questions that we must face up to every day. Regrettably, though, we are not able to continue these workshops beyond November due to shortage of funding, because the whole idea was to roll this out to the entire Gauteng and to get our colleagues from the high courts in Pretoria and Joburg and other related organizations with the present stakeholders involved, so that, and even legal professionals to help us with this. So forgive me for using this lecture, please, Bowmans and LRC, for asking that you help us. I mean, We the People South Africa has established, has got a website where you'll find a funding platform that they've sent up, Give and Gain. Let's try and do a little to get our children, the future of this country, especially those from the poorer areas, to understand where we're heading. And so I conclude with this. We South Africans are a resilient lot, as the All Blacks. We overcame apartheid, and we continue to resist efforts from both here and abroad, in some quarters, to undermine and even to undo our constitutional vision. Bram Fischer has taught us what dogged and durable persistence and tenacity look like. His legacy should provide renewed vigor to all of us who hold this grand constitutional project dear. There is a glimmer of hope. Last week I saw a news report about the Stockholm-based International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance's findings of its 2025 Global State of Democracy. Generally, the report makes for grim reading as democracy globally appears to be sliding backwards, and alarmingly so, ladies and gentlemen. The good news, though, is that our country was one of the few which received commendations for its improved political representation, which would include credible elections, effective legislatures, elected governments, free political parties, inclusive suffrage, and local democracy, and also for the rule of law and democratic participation. It will come as no surprise to any one of you in this room that where we scored poorly under the rule of law was as far as the absence of corruption is concerned. Still, hope springs eternal. So I told you about my one commonality with the Venerable Bram Fischer, my mother tongue language, Afrikaans. I have one other commonality with him, that of eternal optimism. So like him, let me end off by saying, alles sal regkom. Julle sal sien. Everything is going to be all right. You will see. Thank you for listening to me.
Alasal Rakham. Stephen Jess. Yeah. Yeah. So before I pass it on to Rashad Dadu to do the vote of thanks, I'll invite Tandy Elaine to join me on stage, just to hand you a token of our appreciation and the, I think, inspirational lecture that you've given us today in this time of doom and gloom. 1 minute.
Ladies and gentlemen, whilst we're waiting for Nelson, this is not on the program. Thank you, that's me, for such an inspirational speech. If I may read this. From the Legal Resources Center, 13th Bram Fischer Memorial Lecture, presented to Justice Steven Majiedt, 18 September 2025. There's no bride. This is Thank you.
Thank you very much, Justice. Thank you. I now pass it on to Rashad Dadu, who is going to do the vote of thanks.
There are a few remarkable and extraordinary people that you meet in your life who completely challenge your thinking and inspire you to become better. People who are so incredibly brilliant at their craft that their mere existence propels you to do better and to be better. Justice Majiedt, undoubtedly, is one of those people. While I share this sentiment entirely, those are unfortunately not my words. Those are the words of a former clerk, Sifiso Bernard Nkumalo, who served under Justice Majiedt. And today's lecture is a sober reminder of the stature and caliber of human rights defenders that we have the opportunity to learn from. This opportunity to learn and to be inspired is one we all ought to be grateful for. What stood out in Justice Majiedt's lecture is the importance, or the vital importance, of resilience. When we read the illuminative histories of the likes of Bram Fischer, Oliver Tambo, George Bizos, Albie Sachs, Priscilla Jana, and the list goes on, the thread of resilience remains throughout. Justice Majiedt, once again, we thank you for so eloquently reminding us of the importance of a steadfast commitment to carrying out the vision for a society based on constitutional principles, social justice, and human rights for all. And this opportunity tonight to draw both insight and inspiration warrants a generous thank you to all of those involved. On behalf of the Legal Resources Center, thank you to Bowmans, thank you to the entire board of the LRC, thank you to Mr. Ezra Davids in his absence, and lastly, thank you to you all, our distinguished guests here in the room tonight, and also those who have joined us online. In my limited time at the Legal Resources Center, I have been fortunate enough to debate, engage, and learn the law in an arena of resilient public interest lawyers, many of whom are in the room here today. Their embodiment of our Constitution leaves me with a compelling optimism, perhaps even a certainty, that despite our nation's past challenges, current challenges, and most certainly future challenges, the struggle for justice will never be abandoned. On that note, please enjoy the refreshments in the foyer. Thank you all once again. Please socialize and get home safely. Thank you.